I got to a really interesting section in my book today. It was talking about John Calvin in Geneva. It's really, really interesting. Or Genève, as they call it over there. We are live. No swearing. Did you mean to go live already, Anne? Go live already, Anne?
Yep. Just want to be on time. That's all. Being on time.
That's important.
Indeed. Alrighty now. Let's see. I'll just start yammering. If you, the break rooms are always open.
True enough. Thank you for that.
Alrighty now. Uh, 13 March. This and that information. Today we're going to talk a little bit about a somewhat short article or a commentary, which I guess is how you, well, I don't guess. It is how shorter articles are described. They should have forced her to write a complete article, with all due respect, because there's so much more that could be said about the topic. But it's sort of an opening to talk about other things, other matters that are not so ancillary, actually. They're pretty much on the same cusp, as it were, I suppose, of what we've been looking at. I've been introducing a body of concepts that intersect on a perhaps a kind of theoretical plane. Um, a theory that was well that I actually was very interested in for a while during its heyday, and unfortunately, I'm always picking up theories that nobody else is interested in, or at least they're not proximal. I suppose if I'd spent time in England or more time in England in the 1980s, I would have gotten more done. But there's a resource curse of one kind or another. Anyway, Jin Yu Su, um, who is at I think the university in Taiwan. Uh, but this particular paper, I think, has some other Korean overlaps, as I think the name implies, if nothing else. Um, it's an article called Processing with Mechanism, the Renaissance of Critical Realism in Human Geography, at least a nice title. It's a short article, probably a third of the length of probably the article that it should be. But despite that, I've added that to the other thing that I wanted to look at, and that is John Maynard Keynes' plan for an international clearinghouse union. It's an older paper, very early paper of Keynes. I think someone's saying it was the one of the first papers that Keynes published. But the more interesting element of it is that prior to, well, certainly America's entry into World War II, there were discussions of a monetary nature, and you could argue, I'm not going to argue it, but in some post-Keynesian fervor, I think you could argue for making Keynes a monetarist. Of course, that would make some people's heads explode, which would be a useful thing probably at the present moment. So it's an interesting little paper. done by Takakazu Iwamoto. And it's just a little historical piece, but a useful one in the sense that Keynes was trying to clear up the global monetary system and do it in terms of currency clearing. And it wasn't his plan specifically. And on the one hand, he was commenting on some other plans, actually a German plan. And of course, this is prior to Germany's defeat in World War One. So clearly, nothing happened. On the other hand, it is a an idea that would probably convince people to give up any sort of anti-Keynesian notions. On the one hand, if they were more in favor of certain Uncle Milty monetarists kind of beliefs. So you could see, Keynes was trying to figure out the problems and not worry so much about ideological questions or, kind of being marginalized for whatever X number of reasons. So that's the other thing that I wanted to sort of introduce today. I won't talk very much about it because I think it needs a little bit more thinking, more reading too on the monetary system, particularly the pre-World War One monetary system, and more specifically the German opinion of it, I suppose. Recalling, of course, that this is a pre-Weimar, et cetera, view of what the German economy looks like. All right, so the little commentary article that I've not so much become enamored with, but that I think it gives us an entry point into some further discussions. Some of the things we've been talking about before, overlapping or integrating certain concepts. Yesterday we talked about ilth as the as the other, the antithesis of wealth, which could open up a whole set of other kinds of questions, particularly if you were trying to explicate externality questions. That is, that there are positive and negative externalities, and even within a positive and negative externalities, you would have other kinds of variations. And so that's kind of interesting at one level. And then, of course, to go back to our original kind of question, um, regarding some intersection of indexicality, um, uh, both sublation and subsumption. And I think you can subordinate one to the other. And um, and a larger kind of question about the valorization question. All of those things are kind of integrated, or I'd like to think that you can integrate them in a very interesting way, particularly because, as I think today's paper will show, that there's a certain dynamic element that is necessary to address. And from a methodological point of view, I think it's important to return to certain front end methodological questions in critical realism that ultimately never get kind of pushed to where they should, for a variety of political reasons or institutional reasons, or some people who are the leading lights were seen as going a little nuts. So there's a whole bunch of other little matters that are there. Some of it, of course, as I've said before, is that you have to sort of do your research and occasionally sort of either mask your research or code your research so that you don't get stuck in something where, well, that person's only a Marxist or is really a Marxist or adheres too much to Marx, whatever that the litmus test is, and that's going to be the interesting problem. And obviously in Europe and elsewhere, there's more tolerance of a kind of approaching the problem because it's just a scientific problem. And some people are obviously so enamored of their language police stuff that they go a little stupid, as Americans have, and continue to do so. So much so that I think we're into a very, very dangerous period in the next 3 to 4 years of how reactionary our institutions are going to be by the end of, assuming we get to the end of a 4 year period and manage to displace kind of proto-fascist tendencies. Anyway, processing or processing geographers love doing this. It's interesting, but not that interesting. Neologizing certain basic concepts. Processing with mechanism, the renaissance of critical realism in human geography, question mark. Now, it's appropriate for a journal in human geography, but it actually does raise some larger questions that are more social scientific and that have a philosophical underpinning. So this paper fleshes out the advantages of critical realism and social explanation. Lest you think that that's unimportant, recall that the magnum opus of David Harvey was about explanation. It the work that he did his dissertation on, and that has very little marks in it, has maybe no marks in it. Well, I can't remember. It does, I think, somewhere, but it's really not about not it's pretty scientific actually. It's a pretty good text, and unfortunately, no one reads it. But I think it's a good methodological text. Anyway, this paper fleshes out the advantages of critical realism and social explanation. It does so first through criticizing the obsession with processing in the field of geography, which uses time to explain space, for obscuring inherited social relations and key mechanism in social research. Second, the paper argues that under such a circumstance, Young's 2019 accusation that the conflation of process and mechanism leads to chaotic concepts makes great sense. Now, note this is kind of what we've been fiddling around with, particularly on the issue of chaos and catastrophe. While he distinguishes the process as a contingent change from the mechanism as a necessary relation, he combines them to explain specific and concrete outcomes. Finally, the paper argues that this insight suggests the need to return to Doreen Massey's distinction and interaction between time and space dimension, that is, time dimension and space dimension explanations, by comparing David Harvey's views on the Marxist political economy with Ong's assemblage or assemblage thinking used when scrutinizing neoliberalization in China. So there's a whole bunch of things going on here. None the least of which is, of course, a critique of whatever neoliberalization occurs in China, which has its own story and is certainly a interesting literature, an important one too, of course. The state capitalism argument and liberalization and Deng Xiaoping, blah blah blah. So as such, the purpose of this paper is to underscore the merit of causal analysis as advocated by critical realism. Keywords are assemblage thinking, becoming, being, critical realism, neoliberalization. Well, she could have added on ontology and a bunch of other things. So, first section, time connotes becoming, which is assumed in modernist terms to be progressive. Space connotes being, and in this turn implies fixity, stasis. If time is the dimension in which things happen one after the other, it's the dimension of succession, then space is the dimension of things being, that is, existing at the same time, of simultaneity. It's the dimension of multiplicity. Now, we could go further and say, well, is this a synchronic versus a diachronic distinction? Is multiplicity, only a distinction of simultaneity, blah, 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 blah. Doreen Massey, of course, has a interest in these matters because she, among many others, like Derek Gregory, I think, and others, give us a different senses of the question of time in geography. And lest you think that's unimportant, it is, in fact, the same kind of elements that we would build into it as we were talking yesterday, or at least I was, with Paul Kochut's work on Markov materialism, that this is an idea that we might consider further, and find I think useful to well, in a whole other line of inquiry, but that these inquiries kind of intersect. Now, why are geographers, particularly political and economic ones, obsessed with the processing of geography, such as placing, bordering, scaling, and zoning? Not to mention the spatialization of social time change, such as geographies of neoliberalization, financialization, and state making and nation building. In her exchange with the quote unquote structuralist Marxist David Harvey in the locality debate, the well noted late economic geographer Doreen Massey conceives that the ontology of geography, that is, space, is fixity and simultaneity. Now, the idea here, of course, is that the appearance is that it's static, and I think that's not really what she means. But anyway, consequently, the spatial configuration of things and agents constitutes the geometries of power, which might lead to non-interactions among them and produce socio-spatial effects. So there's a lot loaded in that one sentence that might imply that certain structural features cohere in this particular context. In contrast, time implies dynamics and succession, leading things and agents to evolve, produce change, and make progress. Arguably, the main subjects of Arguably, the main subjects of the social sciences are about time rather than space and constitute the axis of inquiry on social, political, economic, and demographical changes. To highlight this, just look at, and this is, many people have made this observation. It always seemed to me kind of parasitic for Paul Krugman to speak at great length about geography and not fully engage the entire profession of geography, which I always found really interesting. Um, so to highlight this, just look at the Nobel laureate and geographical economist. See, I don't think you would call him a geographical economist, but anyway, Paul Krugman, who is hailed for bringing back the concept of space into economics in his brief but influential book, Geography and Trade of 1991. Ironic, however, is that in his final conclusion, he cares about how history matters in multiple spatial equilibriums, or equilibria, actually, which is worth pursuing in all kinds of ways. Under such circumstances, Doreen Massey proposed the idea of a progressive sense of place in which distinct trajectories and heterogeneity coexist, and thus always are in the process of becoming. By doing so, it should change the ways in which space is imagined and produced. Accordingly, rather than remaining inert and static, space becomes open to progressive politics, or in a sense becomes timing space, and this is a big deal in Massey's work, in which space and time are conceived of as being inseparable. Now, almost a century had passed in terms of, in physics, talking about space time, et cetera, et cetera. So, um, and not that it's a new discovery, it's simply conceptualizing certain ideas about social science activity and the framing of geographic, you know, um, explanation that is kind of it's worth sorting out. And I'm not necessarily that I'm going to do it, but somebody probably already has. According to Massey, geography matters not because of ontological being and causal powers, but because of the contextual becoming and processing of transformative powers. Transformative power. In this sense, the processing of geography also refers to the progressive and transformative attention paid by the geographers to the turbulent and ever changing world of social and cultural diversity, which is being crushed at the present moment. Therefore, it should be welcome to lead geography from the study of sociospatial structural determinism to the decoding of the different temporarily fixed institutional layerings and sociospatial locales in the structuration processes of human agencies and social structures. Now, there's a lot loaded in there too, because by invoking structuration, an entire we can blame the French for a certain approach to structural ideas and agency. structure and agency issues. And so there's a lot loaded in a couple of these sentences that probably need a few more paragraphs to sort of work through, which is why this commentary is always is interesting in its brevity. As such, the shift reflects the cultural turn in social science and even the germination of constructivism across the disciplines. The processing of geographical configurations apparent when scaling, bordering, zoning, and territorializing has certainly advanced the field of geography. Instead of being dissolved entirely in the processing perspective, the sociospatial units of the geographical system become more contingent, fluid, mobile, and capable of being often changed and reconfigured by varieties of social agents. So the whole breadth of kind of social theory and agency and all kinds of stuff, reflexiveness, etc. It's all bundled up there and probably worth spending a few pages on, but she doesn't, and that's okay because it's just a commentary. Hence, they come to be in a perpetual state of becoming and transformation. However, when taken too far, the processing approach could become problematic. Particularly constructivists and other critical researchers tend to dissolve structure into process and agency, which leads to a perspective that obscures the inherited social relations, institutions, structural constraints, spatio-temporal dynamics, conflicts, contradictions, and even crisis tendencies of capitalism in shaping sociospatial configurations. So there's a lot loaded in there as well. A whole variety of things that are and aren't Marxist, etc. In explicitly rejecting concepts of structure as remnants of an outdated model of social science explanation, because that's what this whole article is about, such perspectives attribute causal power to the process of reassemblage of the interconnections among agents, sometimes including non-human ones. So already we have an implication about uh, natural capital and non-natural capital, as it were. And so all these things we've been looking at before are all kind of, sort of pressed back into service. Now, moreover, the assemblage thinking argues that the dynamics of reassemblage, and so the implication here, of course, is this is has a circuit-like construction, as we've been also looking at, come from the relations of exteriority rather than constituting internal and necessary relations. Now, without getting off into a cul-de-sac, this is an idea about thinking about the form, noting that we've been yakking for a while about value form. There are formal elements kind of implied here. So, in distinguishing mechanism from process, the next section, according to Jung, the ever-increasing quantity of critical research on a number of geography's core intellectual projects, such as uneven development, neoliberalization, and path dependency. Now, path dependency is actually really important, particularly in what we were looking at in the last couple of days. Path dependency and evolutionary economic geography tends to conflate mechanism and process in the explanation of socio-spatial change. So conflating mechanism and process is a tremendously difficult thing from a methodological point of view. Often not squared away in some arguments. You could even argue, and I don't want to do that here, but I could. You can you could point towards David Harvey as doing some of that, even though I think if you read, the larger body of his work, you can see that that's not really what's going on. Consequently, against the current, Jung endeavors to distinguish mechanism from process, as the conflation might distort the causal links in core concepts and reduce their explanatory efficacy in accounting of empirical phenomena. So ultimately, this is a question at a theoretical level that comes back to the question of, all those things that we talk about in methodological ways. That is it empirically, viable or testable or falsifiable or all of those things? But this is how you approach the research problem. And the critical realism component of this is to ask whether you can actually frame this problem. Well, or if you can frame the problem, how viable is it in a larger, more generalizable sense? Anyway, which is exactly what Marx is trying to do. Particularly, the critical researchers who emphasize the dynamics and variation of the historical processes affecting the consequences of events which shape the trajectories of the processes are culpable. Now, this is the historical materialist question. They sometimes take processes, no matter path dependent, hybridizing, rescaling, financializing, or even local dash global articulating as the explanans. And this is the key point that, is if you look at the early David Harvey, this is, the key point as the explanans, that is the thing that explains, and sometimes as the explanandum, that is the phenomena to be explained. And this can be taken in a whole bunch of other directions, but we won't do that right now. But this distinction of the thing that explains and the phenomenon to be explained is an interesting problem, and a very important one in terms of as I mentioned a week or so ago about the identification problem underlying what we have to do here, because it's a continuing problem for social scientists. For example, in some cases, some scholars use the concept of rescaling to explain the multiscalar governance mechanisms of globalization. And I think this is Bob Brenner and Swingadu, Svingadu, which also covers the other kind of thing we were looking at before about natural knowledge, whatever. Anyway, but in other cases, it is the result of transnational forces penetrating across different geographical scales. So several texts, Omai, Brenner, Zhu, provides a summary of the questions of rescaling. In other words, the scaling argument is, another way in which you can talk about it's not scaling is not absolute in that sense, that it requires a sequencing or a multiple sort of avenues of process. In fact, that we're probably always rescaling if you want to get into a sort of theory thing about it. Jung bases his argument on critical realism, which was in vogue in the in the field of geography for much of the 1980s and early 1990s, but somehow faded under the current of the cultural or post-structural turn in the late 1990s. It's also, a bunch of folks who really believed that it didn't get far enough in the institutional infrastructure. And so that research program never quite dominated, or there were other challenges, let's put it that way. The most representative literature of the era, without doubt, is Andrew Sayre's book. It's a really excellent book. I think it's in its second edition. Yes. Method in Social Science, a Realist Approach, first published in 1984 and revised in 1992. And it really is a masterpiece because it describes, I think, certain structural relations in building a research program and trying to accommodate both the material elements, social critique, a whole bunch of things are all there, and Sayre does a good job of this. It's unfortunate that in his later writing he doesn't. Yeah, I maybe didn't have a big enough army of graduate students or something, but his later work doesn't quite match, I think, the vitality of this earlier work. Anyway, in this masterpiece, Sayre aims to identify objects that are understood to possess causal power by virtue of their structure and constituents, that is, the mechanisms. Now, this is, obviously a framing that is at the theoretical level. It's not it's not as determinative as we might think, even though he's got lots of diagrams, and you know how I love diagrams, but it makes a certain amount of sense in trying to look at sort of multimodal or multidimensional kinds of efforts in trying to find explanatory solutions for things. Jung furthers Sayre's argument by arguing that specific, not universal, and necessary, not external relations possess causal power. He makes this point in the face of the well-known and influential assemblage argument that relations between objects are external and do not define the objects, and the objects hold certain autonomy from the relations between them. Now, without going down a 1970s rabbit hole, these are is still important ideas and important within the context of framing a research program. So anyway, Jung prioritizes the existence of internal, that is, necessary relations with causal power, but inactivates the connection with other entities in the sociospatial process. So you can see there's some sort of reifying or reductionism going on here. More interestingly, Jung's critical realism, probably in response to the increasingly popular assemblage thinking, goes beyond Sayre's arguments by demonstrating causal analysis in a slightly more constructivist fashion. He argues, following Sayre, that mechanism is the necessary internal relation to the outcome and is the driver of sociospatial change or process. He also criticizes Sayre and other realists ignoring the importance of process, which unfolds and relates to geographic outcomes in particular contexts to make things happen. Now, I think this is overstating the argument, and the fact is that there's never a complete division between the two, and it's probably because Sayre doesn't talk as much or enough, or there weren't a big enough army of graduate students to kind of probe this kind of question for geography as opposed to sociology, which is sort of where Sayre is coming from. Anyway, still, Jung adds that the context is integral, not external, to the subjects or objects under investigation to distinguish himself from assemblage thinking. Now, I don't want to get into a thing on assemblage thinking. I mean, I think it's just, your old wines, old wine and new bottles stuff. But I will recall that if we think about assemblage is not simply about, it's not like bricolage, let's put it that way. You aren't running around and grabbing stuff. It is, in fact, setting up relations among elements. It's assemblage is that kind of set of ideas. It's not quite as random as one might think. In this sense, he emphasizes that the political economic framework should be contextualized in relation to historically and geographically specific political economic trends. That should have be, without saying. But in doing so, he takes care of both historical changes, that is, becoming, and flat ontology, that is, a flat ontology, the simultaneity in the explanations of social events. And you can see underlying this is certainly a problem of rethinking or um, updating or perhaps criticizing, particularly in a dynamic way, issues of synchrony and diachrony. Anyway, China's neo so we get to the point here in this article. China's neoliberalization, time and space. To illustrate the advantage of distinguishing mechanism from process, Jung uses the uneven geographical development caused by neoliberalization in China. That's a whole thing in itself. His main target of dialogue is the chapter on neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics in David Harvey from 2005. And there's a larger debate that goes on during this, and it's certainly during a time when Harvey was trying to explain a whole bunch of other kinds of activities, particularly in how vital things were occurring at that particular time. And anyway, David Harvey, 2005. Harvey argues that over the past 30 years, China's state has undergone sweeping institutional reforms and discursive adjustments towards liberalization, marketization, and privatization, which had neoliberal consequences. That should be uncontroversial. Social class polarization with the creation of corporate power and an exploited working class. And, of course, geographical uneven development that sort of comes, as they say, with the territory. Jung accuses Harvey for conflating the neoliberalization process as the explanans without specifying the real mechanisms in the process. And Sue cites her point is that my reading tells me just the opposite. I accuse Harvey for not taking the time dimension that is process in China serious enough and mistaken the simultaneity of occurrence of neoliberalism in the West and the economic reform in China as the explanation of neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics. And this is an interesting argument, probably worth spending a little time on, of accusations of neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics. As you can see, this is a parallel to the expression socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is in fact in the PRC constitution or whatever. In other words, Harvey fails to contextualize China's economic reforms and insufficiently, if at all, takes the nationalist and socialist legacies into account. By doing so, the processing of neoliberalization could make sense with Chinese characteristics. Moreover, Jung identifies a number of mechanisms that shape neoliberalization in China. Among them, he examines the crucial role of the party state, party-state, which will be examined below in more detail. He argues that China's economic transformations are likely to be driven mostly by internal political forces premised on the reproduction of the dominance of the party state. Well, duh, I guess, it's a one-party state, and the Communist Party is the Communist Party. But how does this explanation work? In the case of Chinese neoliberalization, relations, that is, the mechanisms, such as the party state, interact to activate the process of neoliberalization or the actually existing neoliberalism in China. And you could argue that there, in fact, is actually existing neoliberalization in China, the stock market, certain other currency exchange, etc. But the concept of neoliberalization has to be historicized, which I think is the key Marxist point, to understand the specific form of economic reforms adapted in China. One of the most significant contributions to assembling China's neoliberalization is Aiwa Ong's neoliberalism as exceptionalism, mutations in citizenship and sovereignty. And lest you think that that's unimportant, you could argue that this is the same problem that exists in the current issue with Thiel and Musk's sort of tech boys thing. Or Mencius Moldbug, etc. The network state has exactly these same issues. She argues against neoliberalist theory everywhere that China's post-1979 economic reforms should be taken as the effects of the combined practices of zoning technology, the establishment of 4 special economic zones, SEZs, to assemble overseas Chinese capital, peasant turned labor, and the lease of public owned land. And these are major developments that, of course, occur during this period. Now, you can argue that they are or aren't neoliberal. They are neoliberal up to a point, but I think when you see how they've been managed, on the one hand, they are neoliberal, and there is a clear benefit that has been garnered from that. On the other hand, it's sort of adjusting to global trade, of value chains, all that other stuff. It is through SEZs. SEZs are interesting because it did divide, not unlike I suppose the early late 19th century, early 20th century sort of colonization, that they exist as kind of interesting zones of importance. It is through SECs that detach from the normal socialist China or deterritorialization that neoliberalism germinates in China. In this sense, China's neoliberalization takes place through a series of zoning experimentations from SEZs, coastal city zones, to countless new districts in the mega projects, not to mention the recent free economic zones in different states of change, such as during the 1979 open door policy, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, China's accession to the WTO, the 2008 economic tsunami, and even the recent or current Sino-American trade war. When applied to the economic reforms in China, assemblage thinking emphasizes the contingency of coupling the party state, varieties of capital, and SEZs, the dynamics behind the varieties of socialism or capitalism with Chinese characteristics come from the process of destabilizing and restabilizing the sociospatial networking of various agents and actants. Now, as I said before, there's a lot loaded up in here and probably could use a couple of pages of discussion. So, um, that's just the problem with this particular comment. The neoliberalization of actually existing is emerging and performing the sociospatial effects in the variegated assemblages or processes of becoming and succession. Time, rather than space, is the explanans. Um, and yes, that is the problematic element because you can see that territoriality is actually pretty important, and you can see it from a sort of regional perspective and how power is organized in the People's Republic of China. In light of both Harvey's geographical configuration and Ong's historical process, Jung balances processing with a clearly defined mechanism, that is, the Chinese party state. The core mechanism of the state party, as state theory argues, um, is a set of social relations in which the state, controlled by the Communist Party, maneuvers and even manipulates the social balance through diverse political, economic, ideological, and even violent measures. For the latter, just think of, Tiananmen Square, the 1989 incident described here. In this light, state-society relations are genuinely necessary and real, but how specific is this mechanism? And how does it relate to neoliberalization in China? According to Wang, the well-known Chinese new leftist, the hegemonic position of neoliberalism in China was established precisely from within a domestic process during which the state's crisis of legitimacy was overcome through economic reform itself. It's a very deterministic argument, but I think the history will show that that's what happened. In this view, the neoliberalization of China, paradoxically, is a continuation of the socialist revolution. Continuity occurred in two respects. First, the post 1978 party state inherited the organizational power to bring about an unprecedented integration of Chinese society under its aegis from the pre 1978 Maoist rule. This is the changes that have occurred, Deng Xiaoping, etc., after Mao's passing. Second, the search for modernity in the name of nation building had been ongoing for a century already. Yes, in fact, it had, and thus went further back than the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, in 1949 to Republican era China, and enabled the party state to engage in a self-transformation by reinventing the market in the 1990s, and that's kind of what happened. I don't think that's uncontroversial. In the light of Wang's argument, the advantages of the refined critical realism of Jung can be highlighted. Through the lens, bringing into view the inherited organization and the modernity project, economic reforms in China can be processed as a historical project of nationalist revival under the dominant leadership of the party state. That seems to be what, Xi Jinping is doing. That is exactly the point Harvey's space dimension explanation misses. At the same time, and I think, with all due respect, I think Harvey didn't want to engage the sort of state capitalism critique that was going on at the time. At the same time, the sophisticated internal-external relations Jung defines clearly demonstrate that it's against the thick description. And thick description goes back to Geertz. It is a way of how you do qualitative analysis in the social sciences. Anyway, there's a whole story there too. Thick description of the process of destabilizing and restabilizing the actant networks without differentiation of relevancy, which risks dissolving the social structures or mechanisms into a fluid process of assemblages of exteriorities, as Ong's time dimension explanation does, that the trajectories of China's economic reform take place. Now, I know, and this last paragraph, you see, it's got a whole nother article in it. So while this is a short article, it has implied within it a whole bunch of other articles and raises certain kind of structural questions that require empirical study. That is, the question of the party state, the question of historical continuity or discontinuity, and I would assert with the core of the article in terms of a sort of institutional analysis, which is not what she was doing, but clearly it is a kind of institutional analysis that certain elements during volatile times in the PRC, and this is an argument that goes all the way back to, pre 1968, and that is analyzing the Chinese economy as because of its dynastic structure and because of the way that it was composed in post 49, is that certain institutional elements have a kind of protection or autonomy. For example, the central bank. Central bank is never truly challenged throughout this entire period, even up till today. The central bank retains a certain relative autonomy. And the other thing is the military and technology, or particularly aerospace technology, um, the things that allowed them to get A bombs and that stuff. All of that retains a relative autonomy, regardless of what kind of crazy stuff is going on. And so you can see that while there's all this attention paid to, doing the Olympics and doing all kinds of market building and the kind of, you could argue, a kind of imperialism or neocolonialism that China is doing in Africa, and it's a trade with South America or Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things occur in relative autonomy. They're not as screwed up as, for example, the idiot in the U.S. White House who really truly cannot handle the multiplicity of things that go on with this kind of process. Whereas China simply goes, well, this is just another thing we do. Belt and Road, playing the game, for example, in the Russian Ukraine crisis is also a kind of, well, we're going to take this position, but it's a position that really is no position, but it sort of relies on a certain amount of economic force and a positioning within a global material network, which I think is what they're doing, and fairly consistently, with all due respect. So there's that. All right. So I've yammered at great length. I suspect the chat is empty, so no one can make interventions or throw brickbats or whatever. So I'm going to stop the usual yammer, and I'll stop share.